Lieutenant Sarah Chen walked across the campus quad with her books clutched tight against her chest. Students rushed past her, chattering about weekend parties and upcoming exams. None of them looked twice at the small Asian woman in worn jeans and a faded university sweatshirt. To them, she was just another quiet student trying to catch up on her education. They had no idea she had spent the last 4 years fighting in the bloodiest war the galaxy had ever seen. The Galactic Education Exchange Program had placed her at Terra Nova University, a prestigious institution that attracted students from dozens of different worlds. The campus sprawled across floating platforms above the cloud line of Kepler 442b, connected by transparent walkways that offered breathtaking views of the planet's twin suns. Sarah found an empty spot in the back corner of her advanced xenobiology lecture hall. The massive amphitheater could seat over 1,000 students, most of them aliens from various species across the galaxy. Tall, elegant Altarians with their blue-tinted skin sat in the front rows, their crystalline voices carrying easily across the room as they discussed complex genetic theories. Behind them, the reptilian Sauros clicked their claws against their desk tablets, their yellow eyes scanning holographic displays with lightning speed. Professor Vextar, a distinguished Altarian with silver markings that indicated his advanced age, materialized at the podium through a teleportation array. His voice resonated through the hall's acoustic enhancement system. "Today, we will examine the evolutionary limitations of carbon-based life forms," he announced, his tone carrying the subtle condescension that Sarah had grown accustomed to. "As we have established in previous lectures, most primitive species lack the genetic flexibility to adapt to extreme environments without technological assistance." A hand shot up from the middle section. Sarah recognized the student as Crix, a Sauros from one of the more aggressive warrior clans. "Professor, what about humans? Their military seems to perform adequately in hostile environments." Several students chuckled. Sarah kept her expression neutral, used to these casual dismissals of her species. Professor Vextar's eyes briefly swept the room, passing over Sarah without recognition. "An interesting point, Crix. Humans do show remarkable persistence. But this is largely due to their stubborn refusal to acknowledge when they are outmatched. Their success in recent conflicts has been surprising, but hardly indicative of superior adaptation." Sarah's jaw tightened. She remembered the Battle of Proxima Station, where she had led her unit through a space hulk crawling with hive warriors. They had spent 18 hours fighting in zero gravity, breathing recycled air through damaged life support systems, picking off enemies that could see in total darkness and moved like liquid shadow through the corridors. "Their tactics are crude but effective," the professor continued. "They compensate for their physical limitations through excessive aggression and a peculiar disregard for their own survival. Fascinating from an anthropological perspective, but hardly something to emulate." A Altarian student near the front raised her delicate hand. "Professor, I read that human soldiers often operate for extended periods without sleep or proper nutrition. Is this true?" "Indeed, Lyria. Humans can function under conditions that would incapacitate most civilized species. However, this is more a testament to their primitive origins than any advanced evolution. They are essentially persistence predators who never fully adapted to civilization." Sarah thought about the siege of New Gibraltar, where her battalion had held the line for 6 days straight against overwhelming odds. They had run out of field rations on day 3 and started eating emergency protein paste that tasted like recycled plastic. By day 5, most of them were hallucinating from exhaustion, but they held the line anyway, because 30,000 civilians were counting on them. The lecture droned on for another hour, covering genetic modification techniques and environmental adaptation theories. Sarah took notes mechanically, her mind elsewhere. When the session finally ended, she gathered her materials and started toward the exit. "Excuse me?" The voice belonged to Lyria, the Altarian student who had asked about human endurance. She was tall and graceful, with the kind of ethereal beauty that made Sarah feel like a muddy footprint on pristine marble. "You're human, aren't you?" Sarah nodded, unsure where this was heading. "I'm writing a research paper on survival adaptations in primitive species. Would you mind if I asked you some questions? It would be helpful to get a native perspective." The word stung, but Sarah had learned to pick her battles carefully. "What kind of questions?" "Oh, basic things. How long can your species typically survive without food? What's the maximum temperature range you can tolerate? That sort of thing." Lyria smiled brightly, apparently unaware that she was talking about humans like laboratory specimens. "I'm not really an expert on human biology," Sarah said diplomatically. "Maybe you should check the university's xenobiology database." "I have, but the data seems exaggerated. Some of the survival records are almost impossible to believe. I thought you might have more realistic information." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but inside she was remembering the crash landing on Taurus VII. Her dropship had gone down in a storm that registered temperatures of -40°C. She had trekked through blinding snow for 3 days with a dislocated shoulder and a piece of shrapnel in her leg, carrying a wounded squadmate on her back for the last 8 kilometers. "The database information is probably accurate," she said simply. Lyria looked skeptical. "But some of the records claim humans can operate effectively at temperatures that would freeze Altarian blood solid. That can't be right." "Why not?" "Well, you look so fragile." "No offense," Lyria added quickly. "I mean, you're obviously intelligent, but physically, you seem quite delicate compared to most species." Sarah almost smiled at that. During her military service, she had been considered small even by human standards. At 5 feet 4 inches and 130 pounds, she was a lightweight among her peers. Yet she had qualified as a Special Operations Combat Medic, a designation that required her to carry a full medical kit, weapons, and emergency supplies weighing nearly as much as she did. "Appearances can be deceiving," Sarah said mildly. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the lecture hall's main entrance. A group of Soros students had surrounded a smaller figure, their voices raised in aggressive postures that Sarah recognized immediately. She moved closer, her training automatically assessing the situation. The student in the center was a Zentari, a species Sarah had never encountered before coming to the university. They were small, barely 4 feet tall, with large eyes and delicate features that made them look perpetually vulnerable. This one was clearly terrified, clutching a datapad to his chest while the Soros loomed over him. "You think you're smarter than us, little mouse?" The lead Soros, who Sarah now recognized as Crix from the lecture, stepped closer to the Zentari. "Your kind may be good with computers, but this isn't your cozy little homeworld anymore." "Please, I don't want any trouble," the Zentari stammered. "I was just trying to get to my next class." "Through our section of the corridor? I don't think so." Crix's claws extended slightly, a threat display that made several other students back away. "Maybe you need to learn some respect." Sarah felt the familiar tension building in her shoulders, the same feeling she got just before combat engagement. She had 2 choices: walk away and avoid trouble, or intervene and risk exposing herself to unwanted attention. The Zentari student looked around desperately for help, but the other students were giving the confrontation a wide berth. Even the Altarians, despite their claims of superiority and civilization, were content to watch from a safe distance. The decision made itself. "Is there a problem here?" Sarah stepped into the circle, positioning herself between Crix and the Zentari student. She kept her voice calm and level, the same tone she had used when negotiating with hostile forces during her deployment. Crix turned to look down at her, his reptilian features twisting into what might have been amusement. "This doesn't concern you, human. Walk away." The student seems distressed, Sarah observed, not moving. Maybe we can resolve this peacefully. Peacefully? Crix hissed, and his companions clicked their claws in what Sarah recognized as aggressive laughter. You soft mammals are all the same. Everything has to be peaceful and civilized. Sarah had faced down hive warriors that could tear through reinforced steel with their bare hands. She had stared into the multifaceted eyes of swarm queens while planting demolition charges in their breeding chambers. A university bully with anger management issues didn't even register on her threat assessment scale. Violence usually creates more problems than it solves, she said reasonably. Why don't we all just go to our classes? Crix stepped closer, using his 7-foot height to loom over her. You want to protect the little mouse, human? Maybe you should learn your place first. Behind Sarah, she could hear the Zentari students' rapid breathing, the sound of someone on the edge of panic. Around them, other students were starting to pull out their communication devices, either to record the confrontation or call for security. Sarah calculated distances and angles automatically, a habit burned into her by years of combat experience. Crix was big and strong, but he was also overconfident and broadcasting his intentions clearly. His stance was aggressive but unbalanced, weight too far forward. If this escalated, she could disable him in under 3 seconds without causing permanent damage. But that would mean revealing skills that might raise uncomfortable questions. I don't want any trouble, she said, echoing the Zentari's earlier words. But I can't just walk away while someone is being intimidated. Crix's eyes narrowed. Intimidated? I haven't even started intimidating anyone yet. His hand moved toward Sarah's shoulder, claws extended in a gesture designed to be threatening but not quite assault. Sarah had a split second to decide how to respond. She could let him grab her, play the victim, and hope security arrived before things got worse. She could try to de-escalate further, though Crix seemed committed to his course of action. Or she could end this quickly and deal with the consequences later. The Zentari student made a small, frightened sound behind her, and Sarah's decision crystallized. As Crix's claws descended toward her shoulder, Sarah stepped slightly to the side, grabbed his extended wrist with both hands, and used his own momentum to redirect him into the nearest wall. The movement was smooth and economical, the kind of joint manipulation technique that required precise timing but minimal force. Crix hit the wall with a solid thump, his arm twisted behind him in a position that would become quite painful if he tried to struggle. Sarah maintained her grip, applying just enough pressure to keep him immobilized without causing injury. Like I said, she told him conversationally, I don't want any trouble. The corridor had gone completely silent. Every student within sight was staring at the scene, their various alien features reflecting different degrees of shock and disbelief. Lyria's mouth was hanging open in what Sarah assumed was the Altarian equivalent of amazement. Crix's companions had frozen in place, clearly unsure how to respond to their leader's sudden reversal of fortune. Now, Sarah continued, I'm going to let you go. And we're all going to walk to our classes like civilized beings. Does that sound reasonable? Crix growled something that might have been agreement, or might have been a curse in his native language. Sarah released him and stepped back, keeping her hands visible and non-threatening. The Soros rubbed his wrist, his yellow eyes fixed on Sarah with a mixture of anger and newfound respect. This isn't over, human. I hope it is, Sarah replied sincerely. I really don't like fighting. Crix and his companions stalked away, their claws clicking against the floor in an irritated rhythm. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse, though Sarah noticed several students recording the incident on their personal devices. The Zentari student approached her hesitantly. Thank you, he said in a voice barely above a whisper. I'm Ziktor. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't intervened. Probably nothing serious, Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely convinced of that herself. Bullies usually back down when someone calls their bluff. Zektor's large eyes studied her with obvious curiosity. Where did you learn to do that? That was some kind of martial art, wasn't it? Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. Just some self-defense training. Nothing special. Nothing special? Lyria had approached them during the conversation, her expression thoughtful. That was a perfect Aikido redirection. I've seen military instructors demonstrate that technique. Sarah's stomach clenched. This was exactly what she had hoped to avoid. I took some classes back on Earth. Most humans learn basic self-defense. Most humans can disarm a Sauros warrior with their bare hands. Lyria's tone was skeptical now, very different from her earlier dismissive attitude. Crix isn't a warrior, Sarah pointed out. He's just a student with an attitude problem. But even as she said it, she knew the explanation sounded weak. Sauros were naturally strong and quick, with reflexes that put most other species to shame. Even an untrained Sauros should have been able to overpower a human in close combat. Zektor was still staring at her with obvious admiration. Will you teach me? Those techniques, I mean. I've been having trouble with bullies since I arrived here, and the administration doesn't seem very interested in helping. Sarah looked at the small, earnest face and felt something twist in her chest. Zektor reminded her of some of the civilian refugees she had encountered during the war, people who had lost everything but somehow maintained hope that things could get better. I don't think that's a good idea, she said gently. Violence should always be a last resort. But you just used violence to protect me, Zektor pointed out with impeccable logic. Sarah didn't have a good answer for that. She had used violence, and it had worked. The alternative might have been watching an innocent student get hurt while she did nothing to prevent it. Self-defense is different from aggression, she said finally. I didn't attack Crix. I just redirected his attack back at him. Lyria was still studying Sarah with those penetrating Altarian eyes. You know, your biometric readings during that confrontation were quite interesting. Sarah blinked. My what? Heart rate, respiration, stress hormones. The university monitors all student health indicators for safety purposes. Lyria gestured toward nearly invisible sensors embedded in the corridor walls. Most species show elevated stress responses during violent encounters, but your readings actually decreased when the situation escalated. That was not good. Sarah had trained herself to remain calm under pressure, but she hadn't realized the university was actively monitoring their physiological responses. Maybe the sensors are malfunctioning, she suggested. Maybe, Lyria agreed, but her tone suggested she thought otherwise. Or maybe humans are more interesting than our professors give them credit for. Sarah gathered her books, suddenly eager to escape the conversation. I should get to my next class. Zektor, try to stay out of trouble, okay? As she walked away, she could feel both students watching her go. She had managed to help someone who needed it, but the cost might be higher than she had anticipated. Questions would be asked, and she wasn't sure she could provide satisfactory answers without revealing more about her background than she was comfortable sharing. The truth was, Lieutenant Sarah Chen had been one of the most decorated soldiers in the Terran Defense Force. She had served with distinction in campaigns across 17 different star systems, earning commendations for valor, tactical excellence, and leadership under fire. She had been personally recommended for the officer exchange program by Admiral Morrison himself, who had called her one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to command. But here, on this peaceful academic platform floating above an alien world, none of that mattered. Here she was, just another student trying to blend in, trying to build a normal life after years of war. The problem was, Sarah was beginning to realize that some things couldn't be left behind as easily as she had hoped. Training became instinct, and instinct had a way of asserting itself when people needed help. As she entered her next lecture hall, Sarah made a mental note to be more careful in the future. The last thing she wanted was to attract the kind of attention that might lead to uncomfortable questions about her past. But even as she settled into her seat and opened her textbook, she couldn't shake the memory of Zektor's grateful expression or the way Lyria had looked at her with newfound respect. Maybe being invisible wasn't as important as she had thought. Sarah had hoped the incident with Crix would fade into university gossip within a few days. Instead, it seemed to follow her everywhere she went. Students she had never spoken to nodded respectfully when they passed her in the corridors. Others whispered and pointed, their alien features animated with curiosity. 3 days after the confrontation, Zektor appeared at her usual table in the university's main cafeteria. The Zentari clutched a food tray nervously, his large eyes darting around the massive dining hall as if expecting trouble. "May I sit with you?" he asked quietly. Sarah gestured to an empty chair. Noting that several other students were watching their interaction with obvious interest, the cafeteria was a marvel of engineering, with sections designed to accommodate the dietary needs and social customs of dozens of different species. The Altarian section featured elegant crystal formations and soft, harmonious lighting. The Saros area was darker and warmer, with heating elements built into the seating. The human section, where Sarah usually ate, was unremarkable by comparison. "How are you doing?" Sarah asked, as Zektor settled into his chair. "Any more trouble with bullies?" The small alien shook his head quickly. No trouble at all. Word has gotten around about what happened. Most of the aggressive students are leaving me alone now." "That's good to hear." Zektor picked at his food, some kind of nutrient paste that looked unappetizing even by cafeteria standards. "I wanted to ask you something. There's a group of us, students from smaller species who've been having problems with harassment. We were wondering if you might consider teaching us some basic self-defense techniques." Sarah had been expecting this request, but it still made her uncomfortable. "Zektor, I'm not qualified to teach anyone anything. What happened with Crix was just luck." "Was it?" The voice belonged to Lyria, who had approached their table without Sarah noticing. The Altarian carried herself with typical grace, her crystalline hair catching the light as she moved. "I've been doing some research on human combat techniques. That move you used was textbook perfect." Sarah felt trapped between the two students, both of whom seemed determined to make her into something she wasn't ready to be. "Lyria, I told you before, I just took some self-defense classes." "Where?" Lyria's question was direct and pointed. "What instructor? What school? What certification program?" The specific questions made Sarah's training kick in automatically. When being interrogated, stick to simple, verifiable facts and volunteer no additional information. "A local community center on Earth. I don't remember the instructor's name." Lyria's expression suggested she found this answer unsatisfactory, but before she could pursue it further, the cafeteria's emergency alert system activated. A deep, resonant tone echoed through the vast space, followed by an announcement in multiple languages. "Attention all students and staff, this is not a drill. The university is now under lockdown due to a security breach. Please remain in your current locations and await further instructions. Do not attempt to leave the buildings or contact outside parties." The effect on the cafeteria was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as hundreds of students from dozens of species turned their attention to the announcement displays scattered throughout the room. The displays showed a map of the university complex, with several sections highlighted in red. Sarah's military instincts engaged automatically, her mind shifting into tactical assessment mode. She noted the locations of exits, counted the number of potential civilians to evacuate, and began calculating response times for security forces. "What kind of security breach?" Zektor asked nervously, his voice barely audible over the growing murmur of concerned students. Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the cafeteria into darkness. Emergency lighting activated a few seconds later, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made the already tense situation feel even more ominous. Sarah heard the distinctive sound of weapons fire in the distance, followed by screams and the crash of something large hitting a wall. Around the cafeteria, students were beginning to panic, their various species expressing fear in different ways. The Altarians' skin began to glow with stress phosphorescence. The Sauros clicked their claws in rapid, nervous rhythms. The few humans present huddled together in small groups. "Everyone stay calm," Sarah said, raising her voice to carry across their immediate area. "The security forces will handle whatever this is." But even as she said it, Sarah's experience was telling her that something was very wrong. University security was typically prepared for student disputes or minor criminal activity, not the kind of coordinated assault that could breach the institution's defensive systems and cut power to major sections of the campus. The sound of weapons fire was getting closer. A new announcement crackled through the emergency speakers, but this time the voice was different, harsher, speaking in a language Sarah didn't immediately recognize. After a moment, the universal translator kicked in, rendering the words in standard galactic common. "Attention, inhabitants of this educational facility. You are now under the control of the Liberation Front for Species Purity. All non-native students will be processed for removal from this system. Comply with our instructions, and you will not be harmed." The cafeteria erupted in chaos. Students scrambled for exits, only to find them sealed by emergency lockdown protocols. Others pulled out communication devices, trying frantically to contact authorities or family members. Sarah noticed that most of the communication attempts were failing, suggesting that the attackers had jammed local networks. "Liberation Front?" Lyria's voice was tight with fear. "I've heard of them. They're extremists who believe in species segregation. They target mixed institutions like universities and trade centers." Sarah's tactical assessment became grimmer. Extremist organizations typically plan their operations carefully, with backup plans for multiple contingencies. If they had successfully breached university security and taken control of communications, they likely had significant resources and training. "How many students are on campus right now?" she asked Lyria, who seemed to have access to more information than most. "Several thousand across all the residential and academic platforms," Lyria replied. "Why?" Before Sarah could answer, the cafeteria's main doors burst open and armed figures in combat armor stormed in. Sarah counted at least 12 hostiles, armed with military-grade pulse weapons and wearing equipment that looked professional rather than improvised. The attackers were a mix of different species, but they all wore identical black armor with the Liberation Front's symbol prominently displayed. Their leader, a tall Sauros with scarred features, raised his weapon to get everyone's attention. "All students will form orderly lines by species," he announced. "Humans, Altarians, and other authorized species will be processed separately from the contamination." The word contamination was clearly meant to refer to students from less militaristic species like the Zentari. Sarah felt a familiar cold anger building in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced when encountering enemy forces who targeted civilians. Students began moving reluctantly toward the designated areas, herded by armed guards who seemed comfortable using their weapons to enforce compliance. Sarah found herself in the human section, but she kept her eyes on Zektor and the other smaller species who were being separated with obvious contempt. One of the guards, a human wearing Liberation Front colors, approached their group. Sarah was shocked to see a member of her own species participating in what was clearly a terrorist operation. "You humans should consider yourselves lucky," the guard said with apparent satisfaction. "The Front recognizes that Earth has potential, despite your current soft policies regarding species integration. You'll be transported to orientation facilities where you can learn about humanity's true place in the galaxy." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The Liberation Front apparently planned to kidnap students from approved species for indoctrination while eliminating or enslaving those they considered inferior. The scale of the operation suggested months or years of planning, with resources that implied significant backing from somewhere. More importantly, Sarah realized that the university's security forces were clearly overwhelmed or compromised. If these students were going to be rescued, it would have to happen soon, before the attackers could consolidate their control and begin moving prisoners off-planet. Sarah looked around at her fellow humans and felt a stab of disappointment. They were all keeping their heads down, avoiding eye contact with the guards, clearly hoping to avoid attracting attention. None of them seemed to be considering resistance. Near the Zentari section, she could see Zektor looking terrified as guards roughly searched students and confiscated personal belongings. The small aliens were being treated with obvious contempt, pushed around and threatened whenever they moved too slowly. Sarah made her decision. She began moving slowly toward the back of the human section, using other students as cover while she assessed the tactical situation. 12 visible hostiles in the cafeteria, but likely more throughout the campus. Professional equipment, but overconfident behavior. They were expecting compliance, not resistance. The emergency lighting provided good concealment, creating deep shadows between the food service areas and the main dining space. Sarah had trained in similar conditions hundreds of times, learning to use darkness and confusion to her advantage. She reached the service area behind the food preparation stations, where large industrial equipment created blind spots in the guards' field of view. From here, she could move through maintenance corridors that connected to other parts of the university complex. But first, she needed to create a distraction. Sarah found what she was looking for in the emergency supply lockers that were standard in all university facilities: fire suppression foam, emergency medical supplies, and most importantly, maintenance tools that could be repurposed for other uses. She began her preparations carefully, using skills learned in sabotage and disruption operations during her military service. The key to successful resistance was timing and surprise. The attackers were comfortable and confident now, but that could change very quickly if handled correctly. 20 minutes later, Sarah was ready. The first sign of trouble for the Liberation Front came when the cafeteria's fire suppression system activated, filling the air with dense foam that reduced visibility to near zero. At the same time, several of the emergency lighting circuits overloaded, plunging sections of the room into complete darkness. In the confusion that followed, 3 of the guards found themselves disarmed and unconscious before they realized they were under attack. Their weapons disappeared into the chaos, along with their communication equipment and tactical gear. Sarah moved through the foam and darkness like a ghost, her military training allowing her to navigate by sound and memory, while the attackers stumbled blindly. She had memorized the positions of every guard during her reconnaissance, and now she put that knowledge to use. The 4th guard went down when Sarah appeared behind him and applied a chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain without crushing his windpipe. He would wake up with a headache and some humbling questions about his career choices. Guards 5 and 6 were patrolling together, smart enough to maintain mutual support, but not experienced enough to recognize the signs of a systematic assault on their unit. Sarah used their own weapons against them, stunning them with their pulse rifles set to non-lethal settings. By the time the suppression foam began to clear, half the cafeteria guards were unconscious, and their equipment was missing. The remaining 6 were bunched together in a defensive formation, trying to figure out what had happened while maintaining control of their prisoners. Sarah's voice carried across the cafeteria from somewhere in the shadows, amplified by the room's acoustic systems. Liberation Front operatives, this is Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Terran Defense Force. You are outgunned, outmaneuvered, and out of your league. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to galactic conventions on prisoner rights. The reaction from the students was immediate. Hundreds of alien voices rose in surprise, confusion, and in many cases, hope. The remaining guards looked around wildly, trying to locate the source of the voice while maintaining their defensive positions. "There's only one of her!" the Soros leader shouted to his remaining forces. "Find the human and eliminate her!" Sarah's laughter echoed from multiple directions as she triggered the speakers she had rigged throughout the cafeteria. "You're thinking like amateurs. I'm not hiding from you. You're trapped in here with me." The psychological effect was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. The guards were now looking over their shoulders, jumping at every shadow, losing the confident aggression that had allowed them to control hundreds of students. But Sarah knew she couldn't maintain this advantage indefinitely. The other Liberation Front forces throughout the campus would eventually realize that something was wrong and send reinforcements. She needed to end this quickly and begin organizing the students for a larger resistance effort. The 7th Guard made the mistake of separating from his unit to investigate a noise near the food service area. Sarah disabled him with a precision strike to a nerve cluster that would keep him unconscious for at least an hour. Guards 8 and 9 went down when Sarah triggered an improvised explosive device made from kitchen cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment. The blast was carefully calculated to incapacitate without causing fatal injuries, but it was loud and dramatic enough to completely demoralize the remaining hostiles. When the smoke cleared, only 3 Liberation Front operatives remained conscious in the cafeteria. They stood back to back in the center of the room, surrounded by hundreds of students who were now looking at them with expressions ranging from anger to disgust. Sarah emerged from the shadows, carrying one of the captured pulse rifles and wearing pieces of tactical gear taken from the disabled guards. She looked like what she was, a professional soldier who had been pushed too far by people who had threatened innocence. "Last chance," she called to the remaining attackers. "Surrender, or find out why humans have a reputation for persistence." The Soros leader raised his weapon toward a group of Zentari students. "Stay back, or we start executing prisoners." It was exactly the wrong thing to say to someone with Sarah's training and experience. Hostage situations required immediate, decisive action to prevent mass casualties. Sarah's shot took the leader in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. Her second shot disabled one of the remaining guards before he could react. The 3rd guard threw down his weapon and raised his hands, clearly having lost all enthusiasm for the Liberation Front's cause. As Sarah secured the surrendered weapons, the cafeteria erupted in cheers from students representing dozens of different species. Ziktor pushed through the crowd to reach her, his large eyes bright with tears of relief. "I knew you were special," he said in his quiet voice. "But I never imagined—" Lyria approached more slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than celebratory. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Terran Defense Force," she repeated Sarah's earlier introduction. "That explains quite a lot about your community center self-defense classes." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks again, but this time it wasn't embarrassment. She had made a choice to reveal herself, and there was no taking it back now. "We need to organize," she told the assembled students, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "This was just one unit. There are more of them throughout the campus, and they'll be regrouping soon. If we're going to survive this, we need to work together." The students looked at her with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and expectation. Sarah realized that her quiet academic life was officially over. Whether she liked it or not, she was back in the business of keeping people alive. Sarah stood before nearly 300 students in the university's Central Assembly Hall, her captured Liberation Front equipment laid out on the stage behind her. In the 2 hours since the cafeteria incident, word had spread throughout the campus that a human student had single-handedly defeated an entire terrorist unit. The assembly hall was designed to accommodate the various physiological needs of different species, with adjustable seating, atmospheric controls, and lighting systems. Right now, it was packed beyond capacity with students seeking answers and, more importantly, hope. The situation is more serious than most of you realize, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the hall's amplification system. The Liberation Front isn't just conducting random attacks. This is a coordinated operation designed to capture or eliminate specific targets while broadcasting their ideology across the galaxy. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah had spent the last hour gathering intelligence from captured equipment and interrogating the conscious prisoners. What she had learned was deeply troubling. Professor Vextar, the Altarian who had dismissed human capabilities just days earlier, raised a delicate hand. "Lieutenant Chen, what evidence do you have that this is more than an isolated terrorist incident?" Sarah activated the holographic display system, showing communications intercepts she had extracted from the Liberation Front's tactical networks. Their command structure includes cells on at least 12 different worlds. They've been planning this operation for over 2 years, and Terra Nova University is just one of several targets being hit simultaneously. The display showed a galaxy-wide map with red indicators marking suspected Liberation Front activities. Several prestigious educational institutions were highlighted, along with diplomatic facilities and trade centers. Their goal is to create a cascading crisis that will destabilize interspecies cooperation, Sarah continued. By targeting places like universities, they're trying to prove that different species can't coexist peacefully. A Sorrow student near the front, thankfully not one of Crix's associates, spoke up. "What about the planetary defense forces? Surely they're responding to this threat." "The Liberation Front has spent 2 years infiltrating communications networks and security systems," Sarah replied grimly. "They've jammed most interplanetary communications and disabled the automated distress beacons. Help is coming, but it may be days or weeks before rescue forces can locate us." The implications sank in gradually, expressed through the various emotional displays of different species. The Altarian's skin began to shimmer with stress phosphorescence. The Zentari huddled together in small, frightened groups. Even the typically confident Sauros looked uncertain. Zektor's small voice carried across the hall. "What do we do?" Sarah had been dreading that question, because she knew the answer would change everything about her carefully constructed civilian identity. But looking out at the sea of frightened faces, representing dozens of worlds and cultures, she realized that some things were more important than personal comfort. "We fight back," she said simply. The reaction was immediate and varied. Some students cheered, others looked skeptical. A few seemed terrified by the prospect of armed resistance against trained terrorists. Lyria stood up, her crystalline hair catching the light as she moved. "Lieutenant Chen, with all due respect, we're students, not soldiers. Most of us have never held a weapon, let alone used one in combat." "Neither had I once," Sarah replied. "But you all have skills that are more valuable than you realize. This university was chosen as a target because it represents the best and brightest minds from across the galaxy. The Liberation Front is counting on you being too civilized, too intellectual, too peaceful to fight back effectively." She gestured toward the crowd, picking out specific faces as she spoke. "Kextar from Engineering, you understand the university's power and life support systems better than anyone. Lyria, your xenobiology research has given you detailed knowledge of the physiological weaknesses of different species. Zektor, your computer programming skills could help us counter their electronic warfare capabilities." Sarah paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. The Liberation Front made a critical error when they chose this target. They assumed that intelligence and education would make you soft. They don't understand that knowledge is the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy when it's properly applied. Professor Vexitar's expression had changed from skepticism to thoughtful consideration. "What exactly are you proposing, Lieutenant?" "A coordinated resistance operation," Sarah replied without hesitation. "We use your knowledge of the university's systems to deny the terrorists control of critical infrastructure. We organize evacuation routes for non-combatants while establishing defensive positions for those willing to fight. Most importantly, we gather intelligence and disrupt their operations until help arrives." The hall fell silent as students considered her words. Sarah knew she was asking them to step outside their comfort zones, to become something they had never imagined being. But she also knew that they had capabilities the Liberation Front couldn't anticipate. Finally, Kextar spoke up. "What would you need from the engineering department?" Sarah felt a surge of hope. "Complete schematics of the university's infrastructure, including maintenance tunnels, power distribution networks, and emergency systems. If we're going to move around the campus without being detected, we need to know every possible route." "I can provide those," Kextar confirmed. "What else?" Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah outlined a comprehensive resistance plan that would have impressed her former commanding officers. She assigned roles based on each species' natural strengths and individual expertise, creating a command structure that maximized their advantages while minimizing their vulnerabilities. The Altarians, with their natural grace and enhanced sensory capabilities, would serve as scouts and intelligence gatherers. The Soros, despite some of their species' involvement with the Liberation Front, had volunteers who could serve as shock troops for direct confrontation. The Zentari, small and often underestimated, would handle electronic warfare and communications. The humans, all 6 of them on the entire campus, would serve as squad leaders and tactical coordinators, drawing on their species' reputation for adaptability and persistence. "What about weapons?" asked one of the human students, a young man named Marcus who had been studying interstellar law before the crisis. Sarah gestured toward the captured Liberation Front equipment. "We have what we took from the cafeteria raid, plus whatever we can acquire from future operations. But more importantly, we have the university's laboratories, workshops, and fabrication facilities. This is an advanced educational institution. We can improvise weapons and equipment that the Liberation Front won't expect." The plan that emerged over the following hour was complex and ambitious. Teams of students would simultaneously strike at Liberation Front positions throughout the campus, while others worked to restore communications and summon help. The resistance would be coordinated through the university's own internal networks, modified by Zentari programmers to avoid detection. As the meeting broke up and students dispersed to their assigned tasks, Sarah found herself approached by Professor Vextar. The elderly Altarian's expression was thoughtful, very different from his dismissive attitude during their earlier encounters. "I owe you an apology, Lieutenant," he said formally. "My academic prejudices blinded me to the reality of human capabilities." Sarah shook her head. "Professor, you weren't entirely wrong. Most humans aren't soldiers. I'm not typical of my species." "Aren't you?" Vexitar's eyes glittered with what might have been amusement. "From what I've observed today, you're displaying exactly the characteristics that have made humanity such a formidable presence in galactic affairs. Adaptability, protective instincts, tactical thinking, and an absolutely refusal to surrender when others are depending on you." Before Sarah could respond, Zektor appeared at her elbow, clutching a portable computer terminal. "Lieutenant, we've established secure communications with the other resistance cells. Everyone is ready to begin coordinated operations." Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Signal all teams. Phase 1 begins in 15 minutes. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense urban warfare Sarah had experienced since her military service. But this time she wasn't fighting alongside professional soldiers. She was leading a diverse group of civilians who had never imagined themselves as combatants. The results exceeded even her most optimistic projections. The engineering team, led by Kextar, systematically disabled the Liberation Front's control over the university's power grid, life support, and transportation systems. Working through maintenance tunnels and service corridors, They restored essential services to student-held areas while cutting off terrorist positions. The Zentari programming specialists, coordinated by Ziktor, launched a sophisticated cyber attack that crippled the Liberation Front's communications network and turned their own security systems against them. Door locks reversed, trapping terrorists in small groups. Surveillance cameras provided real-time intelligence to resistance fighters. Even the food service systems were weaponized, delivering chemical irritants through the air filtration systems in terrorist-controlled areas. The Altarian scouts, led by Lyria, provided detailed intelligence on terrorist positions and movements, their enhanced senses allowing them to track enemy forces through the complex three-dimensional structure of the floating university. Their natural agility made them nearly impossible to catch, and their knowledge of xenobiology helped them target specific vulnerabilities in different species among the Liberation Front forces. The Soros assault teams proved that not all members of their species supported the Liberation Front's ideology. Led by volunteers who were genuinely committed to interspecies cooperation, they engaged terrorist forces directly, using their natural strength and speed to devastating effect. Most impressive of all were the improvised weapons and tactics developed by students who had never considered themselves combatants. Chemistry students created incapacitating gases from laboratory supplies. Physics students built electromagnetic pulse devices that disabled terrorist equipment. Even art students contributed, using their knowledge of psychological manipulation to create propaganda that demoralized Liberation Front forces while inspiring resistance fighters. Sarah coordinated the entire operation from a mobile command post that moved through the university's service corridors, staying ahead of terrorist attempts to locate and eliminate the resistance leadership. She felt a familiar pride watching her improvised army work together, different species combining their unique strengths to achieve objectives that none could have accomplished alone. The turning point came when Ziktor's cyber attack succeeded in restoring the university's interplanetary communications array. The first message transmitted was a detailed situation report and request for immediate assistance, broadcast simultaneously to Terran Defense Force headquarters, the Altarian Diplomatic Service, and the Galactic Peacekeeping Authority. The second message was something entirely different. This is Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Terran Defense Force, broadcasting on all frequencies from Terra Nova University. Sarah's voice carried across interstellar space to monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. To Liberation Front forces on this facility and elsewhere, you have gravely underestimated both the students you chose to victimize and the species you have attempted to intimidate. The broadcast continued with a detailed account of the resistance operation, including tactical analyses and captured intelligence about Liberation Front activities on other worlds. But more than information, Sarah was broadcasting something that terrorist organizations feared above all else, proof that their ideology was wrong. You claimed that different species cannot cooperate, that intelligence and education make beings weak, that fear and intimidation are stronger than knowledge and determination. Sarah's voice carried conviction earned through years of combat experience. Today, students from dozens of worlds have proven you wrong. They have worked together, learned from each other, and protected each other despite having no military training and no obligation to fight. The broadcast was being recorded and transmitted throughout the galaxy, reaching billions of beings on hundreds of worlds. Sarah knew that the Liberation Front's propaganda would never fully recover from this demonstration of interspecies cooperation in the face of existential threat. This is what civilization looks like, she continued. Not the segregation and fear you preach, but beings of different worlds and different natures choosing to stand together when others need protection. This is what you're really afraid of, isn't it? Not our weapons or our tactics, but our refusal to let you make us afraid of each other. By the time rescue forces arrived 6 hours later, the Liberation Front operation at Terra Nova University had completely collapsed. 57 terrorists had been captured, their equipment seized, and their intelligence networks compromised. More importantly, the resistance operation had been broadcast live to the galaxy, becoming a symbol of successful interspecies cooperation that would inspire similar efforts on other worlds. The aftermath brought changes that Sarah had not anticipated. Admiral Morrison himself arrived with the rescue fleet, along with representatives from governments throughout the galaxy. The university's assembly hall, recently the site of desperate planning sessions, now hosted diplomatic ceremonies and award presentations. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Morrison said as he pinned the silver star to her uniform, "you have once again demonstrated the finest traditions of the Terran Defense Force. But more than that, you have shown the galaxy what humans can accomplish when they refuse to accept defeat." Sarah stood at attention, feeling oddly uncomfortable with the formal recognition. Around her, other resistance leaders were receiving their own commendations from various governmental representatives. Zektor had been awarded the Zentari Order of Merit for his cyber warfare contributions. Lyria received the Altarian Crystal of Valor for her intelligence work. Even Kextar, despite his initial skepticism, was being honored by his homeworld for his technical contributions to the resistance. But Sarah's mind was elsewhere, thinking about what came next. Professor Vexitar approached her after the ceremonies, his expression thoughtful. "I have a proposition for you, Lieutenant. The university's Board of Regents has approved a new program in applied xenomilitary studies. We would like you to consider joining our faculty as the department head." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Professor, I'm not qualified to teach at a university. I'm a soldier, not an academic." "You're wrong about that," Vextar replied gently. "You've just demonstrated teaching capabilities that exceed most of our faculty. You took students with no military training and turned them into an effective fighting force in a matter of hours. More importantly, you taught them to see past their own limitations and work together despite their differences." The offer was tempting, but Sarah felt uncertain about abandoning her military career. Before she could respond, Admiral Morrison joined their conversation. "Lieutenant, I've been in communication with Defense Force Command about your situation," he said with a slight smile. "If you choose to accept Professor Vexitar's offer, it would be considered a diplomatic assignment. You'd retain your military rank and status while developing relationships with the next generation of galactic leaders." Sarah looked around the assembly hall, where students from dozens of worlds were celebrating their survival and newfound respect for each other. Many of them were already making plans to continue their collaboration after returning to their home worlds, creating networks that would strengthen interspecies cooperation for decades to come. Zektor approached shyly, still clutching his medal. "Lieutenant Chen, if you stay, would you consider teaching that self-defense class I asked about?" Sarah couldn't help but smile. "I think I could manage that." As the celebration continued around her, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Terra Nova University hoping to blend in, to become invisible, to leave her military identity behind in favor of a quiet academic life. Instead, she had discovered that some aspects of identity couldn't be abandoned, and perhaps shouldn't be. Her military training, her protective instincts, her refusal to stand by while others were threatened, these weren't flaws to be hidden, but strengths to be shared. Looking out at the diverse crowd of students, faculty, and officials, Sarah realized that she had found something more valuable than anonymity. She had found a place where her unique combination of military experience and academic interests could serve a larger purpose. The Liberation Front had been wrong about many things, but they had been especially wrong about one critical point. Intelligence and education didn't make beings weak. When combined with determination, cooperation, and the willingness to stand up for others, they made beings incredibly dangerous to anyone who threatened innocence. Sarah had spent years fighting to protect civilization. Now she would spend years helping to build it, one student at a time. 3 months later, Professor Sarah Chen stood before her first official class in Applied Xenomilitary Studies. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity, with students from every species represented at the university. In the front row, she could see familiar faces. Zektor, now serving as her teaching assistant. Lyria, who had become the department's first graduate student. Even Crix, who had approached her after the crisis to apologize for his earlier behavior and request admission to her program. "Welcome to Applied Xenomilitary Studies," she began, her voice carrying easily through the hall. "This course will examine the intersection of military doctrine, interspecies cooperation, and crisis response. But before we begin discussing theoretical frameworks, I want you to understand something important." She paused, looking out at the sea of eager faces representing dozens of worlds and cultures. Military science isn't about violence or intimidation. It's about protecting those who cannot protect themselves, working effectively under pressure, and finding ways to accomplish essential objectives despite overwhelming odds. These are skills that every civilized being should understand, regardless of their chosen profession. A hand rose from the middle of the lecture hall. Sarah recognized the student as a young Altarian who had joined the university after hearing about the resistance operation. "Professor Chen, how do we balance the need for effective defense with the ideals of peaceful coexistence?" Sarah smiled, remembering asking similar questions during her own military training years earlier. "That's exactly what we're here to explore. Military capability and peaceful intentions aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, as recent events have demonstrated, sometimes the most peaceful beings are those who are prepared to fight when fighting becomes necessary." As the lecture continued, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that she had never experienced during her years of active military service. She was still protecting people, still serving the cause of interspecies cooperation, but now she was doing it by sharing knowledge rather than wielding weapons. The Liberation Front had failed in their immediate objectives, but their ideology still existed throughout the galaxy. There would always be those who preached separation, who saw differences as threats rather than strengths, who believed that fear was stronger than hope. But there would also be students like these, learning to work together, to see past their own limitations, to stand up for each other when standing up became necessary. Sarah had found her true calling at last, and it was exactly what she had never expected: teaching others to be as dangerous as necessary and as peaceful as possible. Showing them that strength and compassion weren't opposites, but partners in the ongoing work of building a better galaxy. The small woman who had once been dismissed as insignificant had become exactly what she was meant to be: a teacher, a protector, and proof that heroes come in every size and from every species, especially the ones others underestimate.